We've just begun to dip our toes in the beginning of a new teaching series inspired by this time of year when we celebrate Mother's Day and Father's Day. It's a series on family life themes, and we're going to be in this series now through most of the summer. And we're going to start with a series of messages about parenting, and we're calling that The Path to Healthy Adulthood. And the second part will be on marriage and dating, and that focus will be on how to grow in that. So last Sunday, we began looking at a scripture from 2 Timothy chapter 1. The Lord used this passage in my life years ago when I was a young father. Hannah had just been born, and I was reading 2 Timothy 1, and I was pretty clueless about how I was to raise a girl and what I was to teach my daughter. And I didn't have a clue, and I know I didn't because I wrote about it in my journals. You're going to get some of my journals because I've dug them out, these notebooks. And so here's what I wrote on January 16th, 1986, the very weekend when Janice and I learned that we were expecting. From this day forward, I will never be the same. I'm going to be a father. In the book, I had a big Yahoo there. I didn't put that here. Goodness, I'll be called Dad. Your mother, goodness. And I have been granted an awesome privilege and an amazing responsibility in bringing you up in this crazy world. With Tigger, our cat, we just change his litter box, spray him with a water bottle every now and then. You, however, are going to wake me up in the middle of the night, demanding bottle of breast over and over again. You are going to probably spill over 1,000 glasses of milk before you leave our house for your own life. Do you know how many trips to the sink that is? You're going to interrupt us incessantly. I can just knock, next slide, Jacob. I can just knock Tigger off the table and put him on the clothesline. What would the neighbors say if I did that to you? I will treat skinned knees, broken hearts, God forbid, broken bones. How many times will you dent the car that we buy in 2001? This is 1986, by the way. We did buy a car in 2002, interestingly enough. Did Hannah ever dent that car? Never dented a car. Okay, we'll talk about that later. I can't even fathom our phone bills, babysitter fees, car insurances, allowances. And something tells me you won't settle for Frisky's ocean fish flavors every night. And you know what? I wouldn't trade it in for anything, not even a Viking Super Bowl win. And I still haven't got that all these years later. I don't know who lurks in there, be it you, Josiah, or you, Hannah. But I commit myself to you, along with your mother, and we will do our best for you. My greatest prayer and wish is honestly that you will fall in love with Jesus. He is forming you in your mother's womb right now, and where I will fail you probably more often than you spill milk, He will never fail you or leave you alone. Not bad for 23, huh? But we sure needed guidance, and that was the point of it. And reading this passage in 2 Timothy chapter 1, lit the runway for us. Because in this verse, Paul mentions to Timothy 4 things that he received from God through his family and through friends like Paul. Last week we talked about the first of them. What was it? Begins with F. Faith. Paul says to Timothy in verse 5, I'm reminded of your sincere faith that dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and now I'm sure dwells in you as well. And how do we pass along our faith to our kids? We talked about this last week. There's 2 things. The Jews knew that they had to talk it and walk it in front of their children. And if they did that, there was a good chance that they could pass on the faith to the next generation. But you got to do both. Because your child will do both. Your child will listen to the words that are coming out of your mouth, and then they will look at the life that's coming out of your body, and then when they get old enough, they're going to start making connections and doing the math. You know what I mean? You got to walk it and talk it. And like we said last week, it's a daunting thing, but let that inspire you. We don't have to get the parenting thing 100% right because none of us can. None of us is 100% perfect. No family is perfect. But with God's grace and taking classes and learning new things, we can get it, as Andy Stanley says, rightish by the grace of God. And that's a good thing. Well, then in verse 7, Paul adds 3 other things in quick succession. We didn't get to them last week, but we're going to cover them this morning. 3 other things that Timothy received from God through his family. Here's what Paul says next. For this reason, I remind you, fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God did not give us a spirit of fear, but, here we go, power and love and self-control. There are countless things that we should teach our kids over the years, but man, if you teach your kids these three things, there's our roadmap for the rest of the way, then job well done. So let's talk about them. First is power. The Greek word here is dunamis, which, if you're listening carefully, kind of sounds a little bit like dynamite. And some people get a lot of mileage out of that, but that's not what Paul meant, because dynamite didn't exist in the first century. It actually is just a word that simply means power, might, strength, oftentimes referring to phenomenal power, God-sized strength. So you want to ask the question then, okay, power to do what? What's Paul getting at here? Well, let's allow the context to show us what Paul is thinking about, and it comes in the phrase right before us. Timothy, God didn't give us a spirit of what? Fear. The word means cowardice. It means timidity. And so the power that Paul is thinking of, connecting it to that, is likely a reference to courage. And you can write that in right next to power. And this also will fit the context of the letter. If you've ever read 2 Timothy, Paul refers to a number of Christians in this letter who walk away from the faith or fall away from the faith for fear's sake. There were some who were ashamed to stand by Paul. Where did he write this book? Remember? He was in prison. And some of his friends chickened out when it came time for him to stand before the authorities. They didn't have the guts to do that. Paul also mentions in the letter some people who fell away from the faith, abandoned it, deconstructed, because they didn't want to face suffering or hardship. They were afraid of it. He mentions a person who abandoned the faith because he, quote, loved the world too much. He was afraid of doing without the world's pleasures and comfort if he continued with Christianity. And this is precisely why Timothy needed courage to stand strong in a world that's filled with pressures and temptations and threats. Timothy, God's given you power to not let fear overrun you. And friends, isn't that a challenge for us today? Is the world changed really all that much? We have a few things that take some of the fear away: anesthesia, seatbelts, medicine, better roads, smartphones and cars. We have better buffers around our life to make our passage through life safer and more comfortable. But do any of us get out of this thing alive? No. It's still a fearful world, filled with pressures, filled with temptations, filled with threats. So to live life well like Timothy, I need to learn to face my fears and let them not overrun me. This is what makes parenting so challenging as well. A good parent knows what the world is like. And in the earliest years of our children's lives, we know that pretty much we have one mission: to keep our kids alive, to keep them from killing themselves. Yes? I mean, don't drink that, it's Drano. Anybody ever had that one? Get your hand off the stove, put that dog poop down. No, that's not a toilet brush. That's not a toothbrush. It's a toilet brush. Get your head out of the dryer vent. No, don't put the scissors in the plug. Anybody? No child would live to their first birthday if we weren't on full alert 24/7. But keeping our kids safe is priority one only, listen to this, in the first part of their childhood. As they get older, our mission must shift in a slight but very significant way from keeping them safe from all the pressures, temptations, and threats that are out there to what? What else? Teaching them how to face those pressures and threats and temptations. But here's where so many parents struggle. The authors of a best-selling book named The Coddling of the American Mind, which if I were a parent, I would get on my reading list before sundown tonight. Let's show the slide, Jacob, of the book. Anybody read this? It's an awesome book. It's really cool. The authors argue that these days we've lost our balance, and too many parents are stuck today in a mindset of keeping their kids safe no matter what, of all ages and all costs. The authors call it a cult of safetyism. Safetyism. Populated with parents who are often called, two words, first word, helicopter parents. The subtitle of the book is worth noting. I don't know if you can see that, but the subtitle is this: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Now, the authors praise a lot of the child safety campaigns that have come around in the last 50 years. They're not criticizing things at all like car seats and child locks and cigarette bans, making playgrounds safer. Things were definitely a lot more dangerous for kids growing up back when in the 70s when Janice and I were growing up. Huh? Anybody remember this game? Next slide. Anybody remember this game? Come on. This is called lawn darts. You say, well, what's wrong with that? Next slide. Because they could kill you. And I thought, I was playing lawn darts once and thinking, I could take my brother out with these. This might not be All laughing aside, from 1960 to 1990, statistics according to the book, child deaths related to accidents and injuries dropped 50% because of all these child safety measures. So they're not against that at all. But what they're saying, the argument they're making, is that we've overcompensated. We do what humans do. We swing the pendulum so far to the other way that we're conditioning our children today to believe that everything is dangerous and they are oh so fragile unless mommy and daddy protect them. Here's a quote from the book. Next slide. Efforts to protect kids from risk by preventing them from gaining experience, such as walking to school, climbing a tree, or using sharp scissors. Such protections come with costs, as kids miss out on experiences to learn skills, independence, and risk assessment. By placing a protective shield over our children, we inadvertently stunt their growth and deprive them of the experiences they need to become successful and functional adults. A word you hear a lot today is resilience. We've got to teach our kids resilience, and that's a good word. The idea being then, rather than feverishly try to keep our kids safe, especially as they get older, safe from this dangerous world, teach them resilience. Give them the power, watch this, to live courageously against fear. So how do we do this? The first idea, first tip I want to share with you comes from the book. The author recommends that, before this. Okay, we're going to have to dance around for it. Let's do two, next one, and the next one. Next one. Oh, okay, I messed something up. No worries on that. It's the author recommends something. Write this down. Free-range parenting. If you see that slide in there anywhere, write that down. Free-range parenting, or rite of passage parenting is how I've heard about it. The authors tell the story. It's got the slide has a picture of a woman on it who's the world's worst mom. The authors tell the story of Lenore Skenazy, who back in 2008 was dubbed the world's worst mom because, you know what she did? Anybody hear the story? Anybody know what she did? She allowed her 9-year-old son, Izzy, to take the New York subway by himself. He begged his parents to let him do it. And, for weeks, he insisted he was old enough. So they finally, she and her husband said, okay, we're going to try this. So they trained their son for a couple weeks, taught him how to talk to strangers, asked for directions, showed him how to use a map. And then, one day, they let him try it. They took him down to the subway and dropped him off, gave him a subway map, a $20 bill, and a Metro card, and drove off. And 45 minutes later, little Izzy came into the front door with the biggest smile on his face ever. And Lenora started telling her story. It went viral. She ended up on the Today Show, and America went apoplectic. And it started a huge debate. And you can read more about it on the website. She launched this free-range parenting movement. The website's called letgrow.org. Check it out. And I'm not going to tell you what to think or how to interpret this at all. I'm just sharing the information with you, but I want you to wrestle with the idea and information. And let God stretch you and think about it. Kids are capable of so much more than many of their parents believe. They are trainable. Train up a child in the way that they should go. So that's the first tip. Now let's go back to the second tip. Learn the power of faith for overcoming fear. This is a resource that we have available in our walk with Christ. It's one of God's continual commands in the Bible. Fear not, right? Have you read the Bible? It appears very early, over and over again. Joshua was tempted to fear. I mean, who is he to replace Moses and lead God's people in the promised land? Yet God says to Joshua these words. Read it aloud with me, just so you can hear your voice calling it out. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. David talked this way. Next slide. Now, David, we read his story. We spent 3 months with him. You think he had a hard life? He faced some threats and pressures and temptations? David's the one who wrote in Psalm 56, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. Jesus, of course, said it over and over again. Peace I leave with you. Fear not. Words like this. Next slide. Let your hearts not be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. The apostles said it, reinforcing the Lord's words in their teaching. John said, God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. And there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Whoever fears has not been perfected in love. So, how do we tap into the power of these words? Well, just like how we pass along faith to our kids comes with a 1-2 punch. First, you got to talk it, and then, so there's a 1-2 punch for this. How do we develop the power to courage? Well, we take God's word and we speak it till you believe it. Speak it till you believe it. Turn to your neighbor and go, speak it till you believe it. What do good coaches do with teams before they go out of the locker room for the game? What do? Come on! We got this. You got to fire up the engines. And you speak words like this. Don't be afraid. We've trained, we've practiced for this. And the coach speaks it until they believe it, and then they leave the locker room and take the field. We have a song called Faithful Then, Faithful Now. One of the words, I preach to my fears, I speak to my doubt. You were faithful then, you'll be faithful now. That's the idea. So when anxiety overspreads your heart or fear, you speak it until that fear dissipates. You say things aloud, and there's so many verses. Next slide. You could say this word, God is my refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains fall into the heart of the sea. This isn't just name it and claim it, okay? This isn't just magic that we're talking about. There is power in words. Do you believe that? There's power in words. Some of you had things said over you when you were in childhood, and you've never forgotten them, good or bad. And goodness, our kids have had so much fear spoken over them. But Pastor Bear, the world's filled with pressures, threats, and dangers. Yes. So what? Be courageous anyway. The world is big and beautiful, and it's scary too. David said this to God. Next slide. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. Meaning God has our lives in His hands right now. Do you believe that? Your day to die and to go to be with Him is out there somewhere, and God knows when that is. So why not live life now as richly as you can and trust Him to get you safely home. So, courage. Power of courage. Next, what does Paul remind Timothy that he received from God through his family? He's received faith. He's been given power to live courageously and face his fears. What can be better than these things? Well, this might be near the top of the list. What's the next thing? Love. And the word, if you've ever studied the Bible's word for love, the word here is, as you might rightly guess, the Greek word what? Agape. Not agape, as the English say. That's right. And not agape. Christianity.com defines agape love. And again, if you grew up in this, you know this. This is as pure, willful, sacrificial love that intentionally desires the good of the other person. It's the kind of love that Jesus displayed when He went to the cross for us. That's agape love. And that's the word that Paul uses here. Timothy, your parents have taught you how to love like this. Teach your children to change a flat tire, set the dinner table, balance their checking account, all good things. But you teach them this, what a gift you will have given to them and the world. And of course, there's a challenge to this, because we are all born so primally and pathetically selfish. Can I get a witness? Yeah? When we're born this way, we're wired to think of ourselves first. In the nursery of my earlier church, they had this thing called the Toddler Creed, and I laughed and laughed and laughed. Next slide, dude. This is the Toddler Creed. Let's pretend this is a church liturgy thing, so I want your response. So whenever you see the words, "It's mine," I want you to say it with some oomph. If I want it, if I give it to you and change my mind later, it's mine. If I can take it away from you, it's mine. If I had it a little while ago, it's mine. If it will never belong to anybody else, no matter what. If we are building something together, all the pieces, mine. If it looks just like mine, it's mine. Is that not a hoot? Maybe I'm the only person that ever saw that, but I laugh and laugh and laugh. But it's true. Moms and dads. So how in the world do we teach our kids to love, to grow in love? How do we teach them this? Now, this is an area where Andy and Sandra Stanley's book on parenting really shines. Though Andy Stanley's a well-known pastor, you're going to read the book and you're going to go like, where are the Bible verses? There's very little Bible verses in it. It's actually in their study guide. I'm not asking you to buy the study guide. We'll use it, but there'll be plenty of scripture in the discussions. But what they do is fill the book with practical insights and heartwarming stories of how they raise their kids. Because Andy has a thing, he wants to reach seekers, and so that's how he tailors his writing and his preaching. I've had the thought, this would be a great, you're looking for something to invite people, your friends to. This would be a great thing. Got some young friends or young parents or something, say, hey, we got a 6-week thing you might want to get in on. So these first two reasons, then, of how we teach children to grow in love come from the book. First, it starts with teaching your kids manners. Start there. Teach them manners. Now, here's an excerpt from the book. In the Stanley family, we practiced everything with our kids. Social skills were a big category. Why? Because social skills are a way to honor other people. We practice manners, table manners, conversation manners, all manner of manners. And we used redos all the time. Oops, Andrew, that was one of their sons. He's a comedian now, did you know that? Andrew Stanley, he's good. Andrew, let's try a redo on that. And we would rewind it and try it again. Practicing is great during the early training years because everything is fun and nothing is dumb. Later, everything is dumb and nothing is fun. So do it while you can. Next slide. We also practiced greetings on evenings when we were expecting dinner guests. We would practice answering the door. Andy would go outside and ring the doorbell. The kids would answer the door and practice their quick draw, how to shake a hand. And they would actually practice that, getting their hand out to shake the guests. We practiced looking people in the eye. We practiced speaking clearly and loudly enough to be heard. Why? Because these are ways to honor the people we meet. I like that. Now, speaking of honor, This leads to a second tip they give for helping kids grow in love. Next slide. It continues with learning to honor others, beginning with mom. Sandra Stanley writes how when they first started having kids, Andy came up with 2 rules that he insisted for their kids. Number 1 was honor their mother, and number 2 was never lie. Those were his 2 non-negotiable rules. And to teach their kids how to honor her, their mother, Andy insisted, would be practice while they were at home. And it was. While the kids were at home all those years, they honored their mother. And one of the things they had to do at the dinner table is they stood until their mom was seated. And they did that till the kids left home. And then when the daughter Allie came along, they practiced that for her. And what Sandra says about this in the book is interesting. It was very awkward for it with first. It's like, oh, Andy, we don't need to do that. What they discovered is this became a keystone habit, a kind of small habit that sends out huge ripples. And it changed so much. So here's how Sandra describes it in her own words. We had the boys practice holding the doors, standing at the table, until all the women were seated and offering their seats if there were not enough chairs for the ladies in the room. Why? Not because we're old-fashioned or think women are weak, but because we wanted to train our boys early on to respect and honor women. We also wanted to set the bar high for how Allie would allow men to treat her. Next slide. Honoring mom cascaded to honoring Andy because he's the one who required it to begin with. Learning to honor one person set an expectation for how the kids were to honor each other as well as other adults. Honoring mom required prioritizing what was important to mom. Clean room, made bed, respectful tone. This one rule saved us from having to make a bunch of other rules. And, this is important, it provided us with the relational why behind the what. What I really love about their approach is discipline for them is relational, not rule-based. And it makes sense when you start getting into the book. We didn't require kids to make their beds because it was some sort of moral imperative handed down from above. It was a demonstration of respect for her mom. So men, today, on Mother's Day, I want you to practice this. It's going to seem weird. I want you to honor. You find a way. You can do Andy Stanley way if you want. You find a way to honor your wife, your mom, your sisters, those that are with you. You could stand up and quote Proverbs 31 to them and say, what we read, charm is deceitful, beauty of vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. We praise you. Men, can I get a nod that we're going to do something to honor? Ladies, I want to hear. No. One more tip, and this comes from my heart. Don't forget the greatest force for teaching us how to love is to practice gospel thinking. The gospel, the story of how Jesus died on the cross for us, the how and why of why he did that. The gospel, honestly, is the greatest moral force that exists for teaching us how to love. There's nothing like it. Because it changes the way I look at myself and I look at others. When you say to yourself, if Jesus died for me, then, and you look at somebody else. So I saw somebody the other day at the gas station who was rummaging through a garbage can. And I said to myself, if Jesus died for me, then how would you fill in the blank in that kind of scenario? Where maybe you'd be tempted to look down at the person or tempted to, if Jesus died for me and died for him, then I need to care for him too. I need to love him too. I need to respect him too. We'll talk about this more in a few minutes when we get to communion. Bring the gospel into your home. Talk it and walk it before your kids. It will teach them how to love. Which brings us to the final item in Paul's chain here. Faith, power, love, and SC, self-control. Depending on your English translation, it could be self-discipline, it could be sound mind, but they're all bubbling around the same idea. We're talking about the idea of Christ-likeness, of character. What's the challenge here for us? The challenge is not only that we're so primordially selfish And we didn't talk about the reason why. The reason why we're so selfish is because we have what? We have a sin nature. We're not self-controlled when we're born into this world. We're sin-controlled. Great church father Augustine, and a great theologian, he had no doubt in his mind that humans are sinful by birth. And the evidence he gives in his book, The Confessions, is not some great theological treatise. The evidence is by describing what he sees in children's nurseries. And simply observing babies in their bassinet, he knew that this was true. So how in the world are we to grow in this, let alone teach our kids how to grow in self-control, in holiness, in character? It requires a considerable journey. Here's what the journey looks like, sketched out on a board. It's a simple diagram. Let's keep that up there. It starts with, so here you are. You're not self-controlled. You're riddled by sin. You're addicted to some behavior. Well, how are you going to get out of that? Well, here's what Jesus does. First, there's self-mortification. You could use other words, self-asceticism. It's not a simple word for this. What does mortify mean? What is mort? It has to do with dying. This means we have to learn to die to ourselves. And in this case, the journey begins with the no having to be imposed on you from the outside. That's how holiness begins. Anyone who's ever struggled with some kind of addiction should understand this. When the alcoholic first resolves to be done with their alcohol, they're powerless to say no. So legalistic measures have to be imposed from the outside, and the no has to be said from somebody else. So you get every drop of alcohol out of the house, and you put accountability in checks and people to come in alongside them and check with them daily. That's how it works. You're putting to death these desires that are killing you. When I got caught in the pornography swamp, when the internet came along, I was like the French in World War II. It was pitiful. I knew it was coming. I prepared for it to come, and I still fell anyway, and I got stuck and reached a point where the no had to be imposed on the outside because I couldn't spend a day on a computer without feeling the gnats of lust going around my head. And so Covenant Eyes and things like that and getting the computers out of the back room. And then one day it happened. One day I woke up and I said, wait, I got on the computer yesterday and it was gone. And then one day became two, and two became a week, and the healing starts. Until suddenly you find yourselves in the second step, which is self-denial. This is where you start to know you're making progress because you're learning to say no to yourself, for yourself. Jesus said, if anyone would follow after me, let him pick up his cross, deny himself, and follow me. That's the call to holiness. Now, you're still not at freedom here because it sucks saying no all the time. There's no fun in that. But it's getting you closer till freedom arrives with self-control. This is where we learn to say yes to the right things. And you begin to experience joy in obedience. Not a drudgery anymore. You begin to experience joy in doing the will of the Father. Now, if that's you, you're breathing in the air of freedom. So how do we grow in this? How do we teach our children to grow in this? This journey of growing in self-control and holiness is the hardest of all because, next slide, we have to learn how to suffer. It required the death of Christ to put us on that path in the first place. Now we have to learn to die to ourselves. That's not fun. Paul says in Romans 5, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces what? Endurance. And endurance produces character. And character produces hope. You say, why is there suffering with this? Why do we suffer? I made pie last week, strawberry rhubarb pie. It was epic because I'm the pie boss. And for every day, I had a piece of pie. We are habit-forming creatures. My pie is now gone. Oh, I think I have one piece left. I guarantee you the first night that comes by, and I hope Alex, you are here and you're listening. Oh, dear, close your ears, dear. Alex is the health boss, and I'm going to become one of her students. Wow. My point was, before I got rudely interrupted, that I'll want a piece of pie because my body's gotten used to it, my flesh has gotten used to it, and the first time I say no, what's my flesh going to do? it's going to scream and yell. Okay, there's suffering with that. Here's another thing about when we do wrong things is that oftentimes, nod your head if this is true, when we practice like alcohol or pornography or any addictive thing, we are doing that to cover up another big form of suffering that's out there. Yes? Maybe grief. We've lost a job. It's no fun suffering, and so this thing comes along that promises pleasure. It also brings suffering when it's all over. But that burst of pleasure on the front end, well, now here you are finally digging in your heels to that thing and saying, I'm not going there anymore. I'm done with the alcohol. I'm done with the porn. I'm done with the anger. I'm going to learn a new way. Well, guess what's going to happen when suddenly that thing you've been turning to, what are you going to have to face? The big suffering. It hasn't gone away. It's just been hanging out behind your little addiction. And at some point, you're going to have to learn how to face that. So how do we learn? Okay, we have to learn how to suffer. One of the best things that a church can teach its people, and especially the newest Christians, and one of the best things that a parent can teach their children is a balanced biblical view of suffering. And how do we do this? Well, here's one of the best ways. Read them stories. Or watch movies. Stories fire up the moral imagination of our hearts. I look back at just what watching Ben-Hur, the movie, did for me in college. Have you ever read a story or read a book and you resolved afterwards to be better or to do something? I did that with Groundhog Day. That was another movie that changed my life. That is one of the most spiritual movies that is around. Everybody should watch Groundhog Day. It's the book of Ecclesiastes. And I watched that movie, and I resolved saying, I'm going to love my wife better. And I'm going to learn piano. The two are not connected, but you'd understand if you saw the movie. And I taught myself, for the next 6 months, I taught myself chords on a piano because of that movie. It resolved to make me a better person. Lord of the Rings. How many of you saw Lord of the Rings? Come on, do you not watch Lord of the Rings and watch? How many want to be like Gollum? Of course you don't want Gollum. And Gollum's journey into depravity and addiction is laid out. You watch that and you go, I don't want that. How many of you want? And you watch Aragorn. And you watch Aragorn struggle because he knows he needs to be king, but he doesn't want to. But you watch a noble figure like this, and you watch him overcome his fears, and you want to be like that. Even Harry Potter. Some Christians get all gnarly with Harry Potter when it came out. It's like people who are gnarly about Harry Potter when it came out are people that were not read to when they were kids. If you were read to Chronicles of Narnia, it's a story about good and evil. You don't teach it for vacation Bible school, but it'll inform your kids. It'll give them a vocabulary and a way of understanding, and they'll say, I want that. I want to stand up to evil. I want to protect my friends. Read them stories. This is a book we read to Hannah when we were young. I don't know if it's around still, Book of Virtues. It's just filled with great stories from the past. Google it. If you can find it, buy it. You want your kids to grow in compassion or self-discipline or work or friendship. There are these famous stories throughout time that they've been gathered together. And we read these to Hannah, and it fueled her moral imagination. And finally, as we close, we are closing. Never forget what we said a moment ago. This journey of mastering spirit-led self-control or acquired Christ-like character is a lifelong journey, and so we must never take our eyes off of Jesus. We will never come to a point in our lives where we are so strong and so mature and so holy that we can say to Jesus, Lord, thank you for everything. I'll take it from here. We don't need to have that daily quiet time anymore. I'm good. I'll check in every so often, but that daily prayer thing, no, I'm good. I'm busy. You're busy. I got this. If you ever think that you have arrived at this place, you need to be very careful, because I promise you, in the next week, your life will show you how wrong you are. And that apart from Jesus, we can do nothing. And we have nothing. Never, ever take your eyes off of your Lord.